Dr. Deborah Show. This is the show where we talk about bringing peace and calm into your life. We're live with Alan Wallace. Alan Wallace began his studies of Tibetan Buddhism language and culture in 1970 at the University of Gottingen, and then continued his studies over the next 14 years in India, Switzerland, and the United States. During most of that time, he trained as a Tibetan Buddhist monk ordained by His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, for whom he has intermittently served as interpreter since 1979. After graduating summa cum laude from Amherst College in 1987, he studied physics and the philosophy of science. He went on to earn his PhD in religious studies at Stanford University in 1995. He then taught for 4 years in the Department of Religious Studies at UCSB and is the founder and president of the Santa Barbara Institute for Consciousness Studies. He has edited, translated, authored, and contributed to more than 40 books on Tibetan Buddhism, medicine, language, and culture, and the interface between science and Buddhism, including the books Meditations of a Buddhist Skeptic, a Manifesto for the Mind Sciences and Contemplative Practice, Mind in the Balance, Meditation and Science, Buddhism and Christianity, and also Hidden Dimensions, the Unification of Physics and Consciousness. He has edited, translated, authored, and contributed to more than 40 books on Tibetan Buddhism, medicine, language, and culture, and the interface between science and Buddhism, including Meditations of a Buddhist Skeptic, a Manifesto for the Mind Sciences, and Contemplative Practice, Mind in the Balance, Meditation and Science, Buddhism, and Christianity, and Hidden Dimensions, the Unification of Physics and Consciousness. And I'm just so excited to have Alan here, and welcome to the show, Alan.
It's a pleasure to join you, Deborah. Thank you.
Yes, and Alan, it's a special treat for us to have Alan here because he is so knowledgeable and has so much wisdom to share, and I'm excited to learn from him, and I'm hoping our listeners will enjoy that as well. And we are going to be talking about mental health stigma, then we'll talk about mental health and developing 4 kinds of intelligence, and then maybe we'll talk a little bit about prevention and awareness through developing the 4 kinds of intelligence. And we're talking about mental health stigma today because mental health is the largest public health priority. It's also the largest financial burden of any health issue in the world, and that's according to the World Health Organization and the World Economic Forum. And there's a report the Centers for Disease Control wrote called Attitudes Toward Mental Illness, and they found that stigma and embarrassment are 2 of the top reasons why people with mental health issues do not seek help or medication. I always just like to remind people, too, that issues surrounding mental health affect people from all walks of life. So none of us are really immune or can avoid mental health issues. I even like the way people have been saying we get mental health kind of emotional flus and things like that is a nice way of looking at it. And then maybe we just start by talking about what is mental health. To put it simply, I think of it as like a physiological balance, meaning our heart is beating at a nice calm rate, our thoughts feel peaceful, and our nervous system is relaxed, and that gives us a sense of inner peace. I was wondering, Alan, how would you describe mental health?
For a long time, until around the turn of this century, mental health was portrayed and treated by and large in clinical psychology in terms of mental illness. And so this came out of the Second World War, as I understand from the historical reading I've done. The clinical psychologists, psychiatrists had a formidable challenge on their hands, treating the many servicemen coming back from the fronts who are suffering from what we nowadays call post-traumatic stress disorder. Mm-hmm. And so, very rightly then, with the Veterans Administration and so forth, there was a major emphasis, overwhelming emphasis, on identifying mental illness and trying to treat that. And until around the end of the 20th century, I think the unquestioned assumption was that if an individual isn't suffering from any particular mental illness, that person was mentally well. Mm-hmm. But since the rise of positive psychology, beginning especially with Martin Seligman, I know him, I know his story.
Yeah.
There he was at the top of his career, had been president of the American Psychological Association, and yet he raised the question, is this as good as it gets? Simply being normal. And isn't normal, is it really all it's cracked up to be? Mm-hmm. So to answer your question very succinctly, I think there's a very, very smooth gradation or spectrum of mental health, and this relates directly to your issue, the issue like you'd like to address this afternoon about the stigma. That stigma should vanish into thin air, leaving no trace, because it's a completely smooth spectrum, a completely smooth gradient from a person who's absolutely debilitated by psychosis, a person with schizophrenia or other severe mental illness, where they're simply completely incapable of engaging with reality. From that point, we say, well, severely mentally ill, and from that point onwards to the saints and sages of history, the most spectacularly compassionate and wise and mentally balanced people who have ever lived, to my mind, it's quite clear there's a completely smooth gradient. So any notion that there's some clear demarcation, oh, you're mentally ill, well, thank goodness I'm not,
Right. Yeah.
it's a complete fiction.
Right. I love that. That's so true. Yeah, I mean, I like, you said the word normal, too, and I always like to tell when people come in to see me and they say, I don't feel normal. I think normal to me, I mean, the way I was trained is like a statistical bell curve, and you take that middle slice that's like the hump, and that would be kind of normal, because like you're saying, it's like a gradient of just, right, different levels of health.
Yeah.
So.
And a term that I like a lot is mental balance. So if we refer to someone as being mentally imbalanced, then we know they have a severe problem with anger or an addiction or some other kind of real major issue. But mental balance, then when we put this into positive terms, then we can ask, how can we cultivate greater mental balance? And I think it shifts the whole dialogue. It shifts the question, not just how can I get better, be normal, get back to work, and not draw attention to myself, because of my unhappiness, anxiety, anger, addiction to this or that, and so forth, insomnia, ADHD, post-traumatic stress disorder, the list goes on and on and on.
Right.
But rather, I think all of us, wherever we may find ourselves from day to day and from year to year on the spectrum of mental health, mental balance, I think one of the great privileges we have, and perhaps even responsibilities as we have as human beings, is to ask the question, how can I be more mentally balanced? How can I be saner? How can I engage with reality in a more realistic way, a compassionate way, an emotionally calm and resilient way? And I think virtually every one of us, there's room for progress.
Yes, exactly. Well, I think for sure we can keep evolving. I think, though, there's kind of this idea that once it's like fixated, it's like a fixed state of mind. But I think everything, like you say, is in flux. So, right, everything's changing. But I think you've talked, I know about, that's kind of an illusion that we think everything's fixed and it's going to stay the same. And I know you're talking about balance, and I think I know what you're talking about with balance, but maybe our listeners, do you want to just briefly explain about that, what you mean when you say balance?
We'll eventually get around to a brief discussion, I think, about these four aspects of mental balance, which can transmute into four types of intelligence. So to run through just the list for right now, cognitive is a term that all the psychologists know, and almost nobody else does. Cognitive, or the noun conation. But I'd like to give a pitch for conation here. I
know, I like that. I saw that's a different, it is a word that's not used very often, for sure.
And yet it's so enormously important. Conation is this, as you perfectly well know, is this the faculty that we all have, the faculty of desire and intention. It has to do with our motivations, our priorities, our goals and aspirations. And so it's really what we're about. What do you want out of life? What are your aspirations? This is conation. And so to speak of cognitive intelligence, I'll run through the framework right now that I found very useful.
Yes.
So cognitive balance, then. Let's speak of cognitive balance. If one is suffering from a hyperactivity of conation, a cognitive hyperactivity, this would be there's just too much. It's obsession, it's infatuation, it's addiction, not healthy. And it could be for anything. It could be even for work, where one is neglecting every other aspect of one's life to put in those 16 hours a day and really losing it. And then marriages fall apart, families fall apart. Too much. There can be too little. Apathy. Listlessness, no vision, no get up and go. And then there are cognitive dysfunctions where we're desiring things that just aren't good for us or anybody else. And so cognitive dysfunction would be the third. So cognitive balance, the four types of mental balance, starting with the cognitive, because that's where we do start. What do you want out of life? Then cognitive is that our desires are wise. They're not too much, not too little. They're not dysfunctional. They're not destructive. And we really have a cognitive intelligence there of embracing and pursuing aspirations and ideals that are really good for ourselves and others.
I think that's kind of an art that's been lost. I mean, I know because I went to Pacifica and we studied depth psychology. Sure. So I know you're I noticed, you go back to Socrates and Aristotle and Plato, and actually the pre-Socratics, they were very investigative that way, and they would go out in the world and explore, and
Socrates himself.
Right, and they would have this kind of conversation with themselves and the world and be engaged. But I think, we've kind of learned to not be as engaged. I don't know if people are if it's the pace of life, if it's a misnomer, like an idea that we all have got ourselves convinced of different themes that we all follow, or... Yeah.
Well, there's a fine art of introspection, and one of my intellectual heroes is William James, one of the great founders of modern psychology, who died in 1910. He wrote brilliantly on the themes of introspection, of attention, of monitoring one's own mental states, desires, thoughts, and so forth. But with the rise of behavioral psychology, about 1910, John Watson, then introspection was really marginalized, pretty much chucked out. And then really subjective experience was marginalized in favor of observing the objective, physical, quantifiable, which is behavior.
Right.
And there are advantages of that, but there are severe disadvantages. And this whole trend going from behavioral psychology or behaviorism, and then from the mid-1960s when the neurosciences began as an academic discipline.
Which everybody's so into neuroscience, and I love. I know I'm listening.
And the first academic program was at my alma mater, Amherst College, in the mid-1960s.
The first neuroscience program was there?
Undergraduate program was right there. So that's something to celebrate. I mean, that we have a special academic discipline for understanding this most complex entity in the known universe. But I think the downside of it is that there's been an over-interpretation of the neural correlates of subjective experience to the point of even equating emotions with activities in the hippocampus or in amygdala, equating subjective visual experience with neuronal activity in the visual cortex, and so on. That there's correlations, but the real fact is, and there's not a debatable fact by anybody who knows what's going on, is that the nature of the correlations between brain activity and subjective experience remains unknown. So to overinterpret and say the brain is doing everything, to my mind, this is very unhealthy.
It is, yeah. Well, because anytime we grab on, to an idea too much, then it kind of, we get lopsided, too. It's like it's imbalanced.
There's the theme that I've seen from some very superstars within the neuroscience discipline that goes back 50 years, stating that all psychological problems, all mental diseases are in fact nothing more than neurophysiological disorders. Well, I think the evidence has disproven that for 50 years, with the tremendous advances in neuroscience, tremendous advantages in psychopharmacology, and yet during the same 50-year period, depression rates have gone up 1,000%.
Right.
And ADHD, and PTSD, and insomnia, and general anxiety disorder. And moreover, after 50 years of billions of dollars made, and billions of customers popping their daily pills for their mental problems, there is not yet one psychopharmaceutical drug that actually cures any mental disease.
No, I know, you said that. I remember you were talking a couple, 6 months ago, and you said that, well, have you ever seen anybody who's taken antidepressants for 30 years be cured of the depression, right?
Yeah.
That's
so
true.
This is evidence, and the evidence shows that the drugs are suppressing the symptoms without getting to the underlying causes.
Right.
And if the underlying causes were simply chemical imbalances in the brain, they would be curing everybody. They're not.
Exactly.
So the evidence gives no support whatsoever to the notion that the mind is simply what the brain does, that mental disorders are simply malfunctions of the brain. The evidence shows the contrary. And yet, when it comes to the National Institute of Mental Health, the lion's share of the budget is still going to brain research, rather than to research into actual people's minds.
Well, that's because everybody, they grab onto an idea, like whether it's neuroscience. Well, now mindfulness is such a big topic, too. You know what I mean?
Yep.
People are, they're looking for a way to feel better, and to feel happier and to feel more balanced. But it's confusing, and I think then, if you get enough science that backs that up, so to speak, in one direction, then people say that's the be-all, end-all.
Well, I think the mindfulness movement is already pardon me, running out of gas a bit. I mean, it's a wonderful movement. I know some of the founders. John Kabat-Zinn had been a friend of mine since 1992.
Yes.
But the notion of this being the silver bullet, the panacea, this is the essence of all meditation, this is going to be doing it.
Right.
It's not supported by the evidence.
The cure-all. Well, I think it takes work, and it takes time and patience, but it can be a beautiful gift, too.
It is, and it's helped many, many people, so I never intend to deprecate it, but when there's over-marketing,
Right.
and evangelizing for it as if this is the cure-all. Well, nothing is the cure-all, including anything I might have to say this afternoon. So let me round off with cognitive, because it's a good place to start.
Okay.
But then we know we're living in an ADHD world. The rates of diagnosis of ADHD have gone through the roof. Once again, the primary interventions are Adderall and Ritalin, and they never, ever cure ADHD. They suppress the symptoms for maybe 2 years, and then good luck. And in half the cases, they don't work at all.
Yep.
And so developing attentional balance, this can be developed. And in fact, for the last 4,000 years, people with the greatest experience and expertise of training attention are not psychologists, neuroscientists, or anybody else in the sciences. They're contemplatives. Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, Taoist, Sufi, and so forth. But ways of developing attention so we overcome the attention hyperactivity, distraction, mind wandering, deficit, we're listless and spaced out, and then I would add a third character, or a third quality, the same one that I had for cognitive, and that's dysfunctional. So for men, I'll give it a very common one, if men are looking around at women simply for their own sexual gratification,
Right.
attractive, not attractive, boring,
Which is what happens all the time.
which happens all the time, that is not too much or too little. It's really an unhealthy and unkind and dehumanizing way of viewing any person at all. So I imagine women do it sometimes.
I always say that to my husband. I'm like, if we were watching the World Series, it was like a playoff, or they were hitting home runs.
Yeah.
He likes to watch baseball. But at the very end, the man grabbed his crotch, and I said, well, what would happen if a woman did that after I won a tennis match? I was like, oh. And he said, that is such a good point. You know what I mean?
Yep.
It's interesting how we do things. Well, but I think you're not talking about the sexualization. You're talking more about the distractibility, the hyper...
But I am talking about looking at a beautiful wilderness area and say, wow, I can make a lot of money out of that.
Right.
Let's rip a place apart, pillage, rape it, and so forth.
Right.
That is an unhealthy way of attending to nature. An unhealthy way attending to global climate change it's a hoax. Oh, let's pretend it's not there. That is an attentional dysfunction. And then quickly, cognitive, because there's 4 aspects here. Cognitive hyperactivity is where I'm projecting onto a situation, a person, things that are not there, my preconceptions, associations, there's another term. In any case, just throwing our junk out there and then conflating our projections. Projection, and there's transference. You know transference very well as a
psychologist. Well, and if you're listening and you don't know what transference, there's transference and countertransference. And I remember when I first was doing my grad school, my husband, I taught him all that stuff too. But transference is, say that somebody comes to see me and I look like their mom. And maybe they have a negative or positive or, mixture of relationship feelings. They may project out, kind of like those old projector reels that when I was a kid, onto that person, actually, what they feel. But it may not be really anything about that person per se. I mean, it could be more about what's going on within that person who's projecting it, right? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So it's one of many cases of projection where we're not even aware that we're projecting things on a reality that are not there, and we conflate reality with our projections. That's a cognitive hyperactivity.
Like you talk about, like, kind of splatting onto someone, like, oh, Joe Blow's arrogant, so...
Yeah, any kind of projection that is not that's not given in our perceptions of other people or a situation, that we're just dreaming up and then throwing out there. And there's a cognitive deficit, and my favorite example of that is, let's go back 100 years when women didn't have the vote. Well, you know why they didn't have the vote? Because women are emotionally too unstable, they're not that intelligent, they don't have leadership ability, shouldn't go to graduate school because they're not capable, let alone being lawyers or business leaders, because they're really not capable. They should really stay at home, raise the kids, and take care of their hubbies.
Right.
And so a father could have, 5 brilliant daughters and 1 stupid son, and he's going to think the son gets to go to college. That's not seeing what's in plain sight. Because everything I just said is completely absurd, but if you have a fixed idea, no, women can't do that kind of thing, even if the evidence is right in front of you, you don't see it.
Well, don't you think that's collectively true, too? Like,
it is.
If you think of the collective unconscious, right, how that...
I think there are societies that are mentally imbalanced.
Yeah. Well, I think that's kind of what's actually everybody's feeling right now. I know
Yeah.
in my practice and just people I talk to, like a lot of people having stomach aches and headaches and just feeling just uncomfortable. Although I always try to teach people how to feel uncomfortable because, I like to welcome that. Now that I can feel okay doing that and I can meet that, I think that that's the hard part is people have these, you can give them the information, but then what is your recommendation for people kind of transforming into that place and space, if you know what I mean, if they're interested in what you're recommending and your ideas?
Yeah.
How would someone, like if there's someone listening on the show right now that would be interested in learning that?
For the developing cognitive balance and very briefly cognitive dysfunction is where one's way of understanding or perceiving things is just warped. And it's probably a mixture of hyperactivity and deficit. And so in this regard, cultivating, and it takes work, it takes training,
Yep.
and there's very skillful training and less skillful training, but cultivating discerning mindfulness. So the whole notion of mindfulness being non-judgmental, one can kind of go overboard on that because there's such a thing as discernment, and that's not the same as being judgmental. It's
Yes.
being smart
Yes.
and discerning and intelligent and discriminating. And so cultivating discerning mindfulness, looking closely at the situation, trying to set aside one's preconceptions, assumptions, biases, and so forth, it's a skill that can be cultivated. And now,
Right.
very briefly, the emotional. It's kind of the it's the icing on the cake. Cognitive's kind of crescendo. Cognitive, attentional, cognitive, and then emotional, thanks to Dan Goleman and the Yale psychologist on whose work he drew. We know a lot about emotional intelligence now. But I'd like to bring back the same framework. If one is emotionally hyperactive, we know what that means. It's one is just over-responsive, hypersensitive, hyper-emotional, unstable, emotionally unstable. One can also be have emotional deficit, can be out of touch with emotions, emotionally unresponsive, and so forth, kind of dead within,
Yep.
like giving up. And the third one is, and I'll finish here on this note, emotional dysfunction, where the emotions themselves are just flat out unhealthy. There's something toxic about that. And the Germans have a good term for one of these, and Schadenfreude, taking delight in others' misfortune. Well, that's an emotion.
That's so common too.
It
yeah.
is emotion,
Yeah.
but it's nasty.
It is nasty, but it is interesting. I notice, I talk to patients about this too. Like, if you go into the supermarket and you're kind of in a down mood or something, it's almost like the Schadenfreude. Is that
Schadenfreude.
Schadenfreude.
Uh-huh.
It's almost like that gets activated because then I notice it's like an opportunity. Even though I'm okay with it, I can regroup and
Sure.
recalibrate myself.
Sure.
Because I've practiced that, like you're saying. I think what you're also saying, Alan, just for people who are listening, is, really just to be patient with yourself because it does take time. It's like anything you want to cultivate, right? I mean, if you want to learn a skill. But I think it's the best investment you can give yourself because you can actually show you care about yourself and love yourself. And then you will have the ability to love and, I think, connect and care about other people. And I did my research on dynamic regulation, which is like, when we get hyper aroused and we get hypo aroused, and I kind of liken it to like a car engine. And I think it's related to what you're talking about with the hyperactivity and the hypoactivity.
Very similar.
And it's kind of the hyper arousals, you can feel it, and your body gets very activated and aroused there. So your body's a good source, right, too, to kind of learn. I like to teach people to check in more with their tummy, with their heart, and see what's going on more, and not just be so heady. And that, I guess, is the part with the neuroscience, is that it is good because you can see pictures and you can kind of see what's going on.
Sure.
But also there's just, make sure, to be balanced that way, too, like you take in all the information.
Yeah. I think it's really wonderful to develop this type of discerning mindfulness, but on parallel tracks, and that is somatic sensations are not the same as emotions. The neurologist Antonio Damasio wrote a book years ago called The Feeling of What Happens, and he makes a number of good points, and one of them is that for whatever emotion we experience psychologically, one may be anxious because one's child is going off to school for the first day. Just how will it turn out?
Yeah.
So that's a psychological. My child is only 5 years old. So it's a psychological. But as you're experiencing that, do you feel anything in your tummy? Do you feel anything in your heart? And these are somatic.
Right.
So the psychological and somatic, they're not the same, but there's a correlation. And as with brain activity and subjective experience, they're not the same, but they are correlated.
They're intertwined.
And we should be intertwined, and we should be looking at both of them.
Right.
But not let either one negate the other.
I kind of feel like, for those of you who are listening, so somatic psychology is like Alan's saying, all your body kind of I like Candace Pert's work on that, because she wrote a book called Molecules in Motion, and it's kind of about how you carry your memories in your cells. So there's actually a place, but I think physics and somatic psychology are going to collide. Well, they already kind of are, because it may explain the uncertainty of things or the unknowing of things. And I feel like also we're so focused on knowing everything too. Maybe we just have to learn to experience things more too. And
there's such a thing as being content with not being able to know for a while, and then still doing one's best.
Yeah.
The insistence that I need to get clear first. Well, sometimes that's just not realistic.
There's a great book. It's by a psychiatrist that I almost did my research with, Donald Marcus, and he's an MD, and it's called On Knowing What One Knows. And the idea behind it is kind of like, as soon as you think you know something, that's kind of a sign that you actually don't know it. And just to kind of keep practicing and learning and opening yourself up. And maybe you did accomplish some level, where you got something clicked in, but there's more to that.
Sure.
Thank you for explaining all that. Yeah, and if you're interested in learning more, too, about Alan's concepts, I know he has a website that you can go to, which is SB. Is it on there?
SBinstitute.com.
So if you're interested.
And the Santa Barbara Institute.com,
Yeah. I was wondering, Alan, from your experience, how do you think that developing those 4 kinds of intelligence and mental health kind of intersect? I know you kind of said that, but just maybe more.
Well, I've spoken before medical healthcare professionals all over the world, in university settings and so forth. And I present this a lot because I think it has potentially a lot of explanatory power, in the same sense that the Mendeleev periodic table of elements, when he came out with that, then you could see how everything has a framework, and everything, all the different elements fit together. And you can also predict the existence of elements that you haven't seen before. From what I hear, as an outsider with absolutely no psychological training whatsoever.
Well, you probably, at this point, I think you've been around a lot of psychology.
Well, I read it, but again, I never want to give any pretense of, oh yes, I'm, anything remotely like a clinical psychologist.
They'll probably give you that, though, soon. Right?
Well, I'm not going to hold my breath. But I have asked psychiatrists and clinical psychologists, and I've yet to meet one person who thinks the DSM-5, the latest encyclopedia of mental disease, is really great.
Yeah, what I tell people is, especially I worked at county mental health, so I used to do like 1,000 evaluations a month, and that was only one of my jobs. So, the psychiatrists, they teach you and train you at hospitals and clinics to diagnose someone. But, one, people's diagnoses change, just to keep that in mind.
Sure.
And 2, the diagnosis, it's more, I think that especially if you use insurance, they make you do that. And also, it's more important what the person's symptoms are. That's what I try to work with, and also their strengths, because we were talking about ADD earlier.
Yeah.
And I know when I was finishing my research at UCLA Medical School, every week, they churn out new research, and this is still not even out in the media and stuff, but it's an important point, which is that if you look at a sensory integration spectrum disorder like autism, Asperger's, ADD, ADHD, they're all related to senses, which is what I know you're interested in as well, which seems very, relevant. And that we all have different sensitivities. If we look at each of ourselves, I might be more sensitive to sound, and you might be more sensitive to touch. I don't know what it is. Sure. But then there's all these other wonderful strengths to draw on, right?
Indeed.
But see, it's kind of indicative of our nature, of where our world's at, I think. But maybe you could disagree with me. It's okay. That we've learned to disconnect, to plug it into an answer. But it might not be very beneficial for us, because then I think we get so labeled by the DSM. You know what I mean?
Well, I think, to my mind, again, as an outsider, but I can still have an opinion. Maybe it's just simply uninformed and ignorant. I'm happy to learn. But it seems to be helter-skelter. Just a whole array of mental diseases, but no overarching framework. Whereas what I'm suggesting here is this might have some real potential in this regard. Cognitive, attentional, cognitive, and emotional. Too much, too little, and dysfunctional. And then I've spoken again with many mental health care professionals, and I've asked them, can you tell me any mental disease that cannot be understood within this context of not just one, but it could be a cognitive hyperactivity with an emotional deficit. It could be an attentional dysfunction with a cognitive,
no, we don't have those,
and so forth.
yet.
And that no one has been able to point to a single mental disease. There's no, that's completely outside the framework you presented. But if we take these four and then looking into relationships, that the mind, every aspect of the mind is interwoven with the other aspects, then this might be a very helpful periodic table of mental diseases, but again, not just mental diseases, because it's a smooth spectrum. There are people who are absolutely debilitated by severe imbalances, cognitive, attentional, cognitive, and emotional. They're really pathological. And then there are people with incredibly sublime mental health, a smooth spectrum all the way through. And so to try to identify specific mental imbalances, diseases, problems within that matrix, within that grid, and then see this is a combination of this and that, then that is symptomatic. And then you can look for causes. And where I bridle, I have resistance.
Bristle?
I bristle, I bridle.
You pull back.
I do. And that is when I encounter reductionism.
Yes.
And that is, well, after all, this is simply a brain imbalance, so let's just find the right drug for you.
It's very
Oh, by the way, it
inexpansive.
will not cure anything, but it will kill the messenger is what it's going to do.
Right. Well,
It
it's
suppresses the
oppressive.
symptom.
Yeah.
And so that, again, I don't want to be a fanatic myself. And for a patient, as you know so well, a person who's debilitated by acute and severe depression, what they need more than anything else is to have the symptoms suppressed. Because they can't benefit from talk therapy, let alone meditation or anything else. They just need to get their head above water. So there's a place for suppression of symptoms, as there is for a person who's in extreme pain, dying of bone marrow cancer, bone cancer. A friend of mine did.
Yep. My
And so
father-in-law
the
did.
best thing is morphine. Because you
Yeah.
can't cure them, but what you can do is
Relieve
manage
their
the symptoms.
suffering.
So I never deprecate the value of suppressing symptoms, but that should never be conflated with medical treatment.
Right.
And medical treatment should be to heal. And so if we could take a non-reduction approach, then for any of those four, cognitive right through emotional, sometimes I think we'd find that the primary cause that can be addressed is environmental. Take the person out of the environment, the problem is already, half solved. Sometimes it can be in the immediate social environment. It could be in the family, an abusive family. Sometimes it could be one's own behavior can aggregate one's own mental problems. If one is very harsh and abusive, ridiculing, contemptuous of other people, that's not going to have a good impact on your own mind.
Right.
And then there are physiological, biological, and these two play a factor. And there are psychological, of course, attitudes. If one is always focusing on the negative things, has low self-esteem, looks down on other people, that's going to influence your overall mental well-being. So if we take into account environmental, social, behavioral, physiological, and psychological factors in a very holistic way, without being reductionistic anywhere, then for the treatment of mental disease, but then also looking on the upside, how can we develop exceptional cognitive intelligence, attentional, cognitive, and emotional intelligence, and again look for environmental and social, behavioral, biological, and psychological factors to bring about optimal mental health. And I look at I'll be very brief here, but looking at my generation, I think I'm about one generation older than you. My generation, my parents' generation, and yours, we've given the younger generation, your children, quite a challenge. To get through the next century is not going to be easy.
I know, my 13-year-old, and I think of him as my teacher, actually.
Yeah.
And he says to me, wow, the world is really in a
Well,
left a lot of work
we
for us.
really dished it up to them. We took all the
That's true.
benefits and left them the dregs, I'm sorry to say. In which case, we've left them with enormous challenges.
Although, I guess, I don't know, I remember Gandhi, he always said out of turbulence comes peace. And so
May it be so.
I feel like we're in this very turbulent time, which is very, very uncomfortable for everyone, but
Yeah.
maybe it will cause people to reevaluate and maybe go back to what is more healthy and important to them. But I could see I could go lots of different ways. I guess I'm just more optimistic.
Well, Gandhi was dealing with social injustices and so forth, and imperialism and all of that. What we're dealing with now with the impact of humanity on the natural environment
Right.
is something that it's not going to go away by itself.
Yep.
And so, to my mind, I think my generation, your generation, we have a moral obligation and moral imperative to give our children and grandchildren the best possible education, not just to make a living, but to develop the mental skills, cognitive, attentional, cognitive, and emotional skills, to be able to face the challenges we've given them and be able to come out with a happy ending.
Do you think that we could implement that more like in our schools or in our education settings? And would that be at all levels of education?
Sure. You introduced me as a Buddhist, and I've been a Buddhist for almost 50 years now. But I don't think a word I said would be relevant only to Buddhists.
Right.
I never even raised the topic, or any Buddhist belief system and so forth and so on. That's kind of my business. So I think every issue I've raised here is equally relevant for religious fundamentalists of any sort, agnostic, atheist, materialist.
Right, crosses every cross.
Yeah, in other words, I see no reason why the elements of these, part of it is mindfulness training that gets into the school system, social emotional learning gets into the educational system. Why not go broadband and really help children develop cognitive intelligence, develop attention skills, without which they're not going to get an education anyway, cognitive, so they're developing discerning mindfulness and intelligence, and then emotional intelligence they're all going to need because they'll be facing a lot of challenges. I think everything I've been discussing here could be implemented in school systems from elementary school right on, without ruffling any feathers.
I think there's more schools doing that too. I mean, I know I've gone in school. I've taught like thousands of kids. I have a very simple little meditation. I used to go on Mondays. I don't have as much time anymore. But I think I noticed that even with my son's grade, just watching from kindergarten, now he just started junior high, but up through that group of kids, even though I wasn't seeing them as much, they had that foundation of and also I think conflict resolution, because you can resolve the conflict within yourself. I think that would take a major, I was just thinking how we would cultivate for each person to have the ability to have this discerning attitude, right, that you're discussing of being able to tap into themselves and learn what's going on. And I think that's hard because when everybody's doing the same you know what I mean? It's kind of the herd mentality. It's almost like we need to revamp the like focus or
I think the cultivation of discerning mindfulness could be a good antidote towards herd mentality, which we see in American politics today. I'm not pointing a finger on the left or the right. It's there. We can all see it. And I think what we, as the American public, we would like to see far, far, far more bipartisan efforts where people are putting the country first and political agendas of the left or the right second. It's fine to have your opinion, but to make one's own partisan politics, trump overall the well-being of the whole country is demise of democracy.
Although I kind of feel like I was saying before about Gandhi, that maybe it's kind of like the final coup de grace.
When
like
things get really painful.
Like this extreme suffering.
When things get really painful, people can actually have a motivation to bring about deep change.
Exactly.
Yep.
I mean, isn't that
he's right there.
I mean, I think that's kind of what happened in the 60s. But also, I know people, I was listening to someone, they were talking about the word apocalypse, and they were saying, oh, that's not a negative thing because actually that means to like reveal something, to peel it,
etymologically it's probably pretty good,
Is that, or is that not accurate?
I don't think I'd want to be on the barrel end of an apocalypse myself.
The way that this person I was listening to, it was like a pastor, someone on just some video I found, but it was like she was talking about how the root of the word apocalypse means to uncover or reveal.
Well, etymologically, it's great, but we all know apocalypse
has a bigger meaning.
Has a pretty dark side.
Well, and I think that, I think we're all, I know you talked too about the pursuit of happiness, and I think, that's something that's always actually been very important to me, because I think, I just grew up, I'm kind of a cowgirl, so I feel like I did have the fortunate upbringing to be around nature a lot and have my senses, and that helped. It still helps with a lot of happiness. I was wondering if maybe you could explain a little bit the pursuit of happiness just for our listeners. And I know you have an expansive way of explaining that, but I know you talk about like the dimensions of human flourishing.
This is one of my favorite topics to address because, again, it doesn't raise any barriers. It's not for religious people versus non, or for Christian but not for Muslims and so forth, or anybody else. And so I've really, as a scholar, I'm a PhD in religious studies, I did a lot of comparative work. A distinction between two types of happiness runs through the Greek tradition, through Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. It runs in the Buddhist tradition. It goes to St. Augustine in the Christian tradition, in the Hindu tradition. In other words, nobody has a monopoly, not religious people or philosophers. And now, since the rise of positive psychology roughly 20 years ago, then this distinction is being drawn in modern positive psychology as well. So the two types of happiness, I'll use the Greek terms, are eudaimonia, human flourishing, genuine well-being, genuine happiness, and then hedonia. hedonia, but now I want to make really clear that hedonia is not just being hedonistic, vulgar, crude, boozing, partying. That's not what I mean at all. Of course, clearly there are hedonistic people, and they can be as vulgar as anybody else. But when I use the term, I'm using it now with a very sharp knife, very precise definition.
Mm-hmm.
And hedonia, I will define. It's my choice, and I find this useful. That's all.
Yeah.
That hedonia is any type of pleasure I experience, pleasure, happiness, joy, that I experience in response to some favorable stimulus. It can be seeing a beautiful painting, listening to beautiful music, tasting wonderful food, getting a nice massage, engaging in an enjoyable and meaningful conversation, thinking happy thoughts, thinking positive thoughts. That's a pleasant stimulation.
Yeah.
Going down memory lane. So there's nothing wrong with any of those things, but they are stimulus-driven. Take away the stimulus, the pleasure vanishes.
Well, that's the thing. Everybody's so addicted to stimulus.
Precisely.
Well, now the phones and also, it becomes. I feel like people live in denial then, because then they just jump right over that, and then that just becomes their mode of living.
Well, it's an addiction to stimulation.
It is,
and
exactly.
now more than any time in recorded history. And so this is not healthy. It is a type of cognitive hyperactivity, an addiction to stimulation, addiction to work, entertainment, and so forth. And so that's all hedonia. And it's not necessarily bad, but it does tend to be competitive. And the way that people, in terms of pursuits of hedonia, there tend to be three, and these are classic. How can I get more pleasure out of life? One thing, wealth. I need to get more money. Because there's an old axiom that goes, if you think money can't buy happiness, you don't know where to shop.
Well, yeah, and I remember my grandma should say, if you've got money, you've got honey, or something like that.
Yeah, we have a lot of cliches for that. And for hedonia, there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, sensual pleasures and so forth. You get friends with money, you can get pseudo-friends and so forth. So one is wealth, one is fame, reputation, status, prestige, and another one is power, influence. And so those tend to be three avenues that people, any one or combination of those three, and by way of the acquisition of wealth, power, and prestige, then we can get more hedonia. But the problem with it, built into it, is by nature it tends to be competitive. If I have more, somebody else has less. If the United States has more, Mexico and Canada have less, etc. And people who have less don't like it, which means it's not going to be stable. When 8 people on the planet own as much as the poor 3.5 billion on the planet, which is true.
It's big, yeah.
Those 3.5 billion people are going to say, wait a minute. And that is not a stable situation, because those 8 people can't imagine how to spend all that money. And so that's hedonia. But then the sages of humanity, again, it's not pitching one religion or philosophy or anything else. It's universal, and it's part of our common heritage as human beings, going back at least as far as the Buddha and back to the Jewish tradition and so forth. And that is the second one, eudaimonia. So it's a Greek term, human flourishing, but it's something we've all experienced but probably didn't have a name for it. And it's a type of well-being. It can be even a happiness, a contentment, a sense of fulfillment, of meaning that's not coming from what we get from the world, but from what we bring to it. So it's not stimulus-driven. So I'll give you an example any 5-year-old can understand. Give a 5-year-old, let's say a little boy, give him a brand new bike, just the kind he wanted for Christmas. And he gets it and experiences hedonia. He's just overjoyed. It's the color he wanted, just the right size. He goes and gives mom and dad a big hug. He's so happy. And that's hedonic. There's nothing wrong with that. He got a new bike. He's very happy. That's hedonia. On the other hand, the parents who have just given their child something they knew the child really wanted, they're experiencing eudaimonia. Or the child who makes breakfast for her parents, brings them breakfast in bed. And they're already happy before they even see their parents' happy faces and seeing them enjoying the food, already preparing the food, thinking, don't burn the toast and make the eggs like this, and they're going to really enjoy this, and already getting some pleasure from this. It's not because something pleasurable is coming to you.
It's the giving, yeah.
It's the eudaimonic, happiness of generosity, of kindness, of being sensitive, attentive to the needs of others, leading an ethical way of life. And by ethical, I mean something absolutely non-dogmatic. By ethical, I mean, and I think I'm following Gandhi here, first of all, nonviolent. Nonviolent towards human beings, but frankly, let's not count the animals out. They have feelings too.
Yeah.
Nonviolent towards
animals. Or the trees or anything.
Nonviolent towards the environment.
Yeah.
Because we're being violent towards the environment. That's imperiling human civilization.
Yep.
So first of all, nonviolent, and then secondly, when the opportunity arises, being benevolent. You're lending a hand, you know. The Dalai Lama said, kindness is my religion. Well, that's lending a hand. And so leading an ethical way of life, rooted in nonviolence and benevolence and generosity of caring and so forth, there's a sense of well-being that comes from that.
I think kindness is another word that people use a lot, like the neuroscience or being mindful, you know, is, sure. Oh, well, I'm a kind person. But then they kind of maybe misconstrue or don't think of it in the way you're discussing, where it's like an offering or a giving.
It is.
But I guess as I'm sitting listening to you, I'm thinking of a flower, because I think a flower is like the perfect way to relate. You know, you plant a seed and it grows and it blossoms, and if you let each person have, you know what I mean, they can flourish, right?
Indeed.
Well, and also during the Greco-Roman times, the natura physiciae were the people who would go out, right, and explore the world before we had physicians and doctors.
Yeah.
And that's how they learned about themselves and the world around them. It was a combination. But yeah, I feel like we've left our psyche or our soul or ourselves a little behind, and people are scrambling to try to figure that out. And they like the apps, and they like the you know, different, like the neuroscience and all that, because it gives them a sense of what's happening. But then the introspection part is so hard to look at ourselves, because I think, you know, when we have all that, then we have suffering, and then what do we do with the suffering? That's why I like the mindfulness and the meditation.
Yeah, but ignorance is not bliss.
Yeah.
That is ignoring, you know, balking from looking within and seeing what actually are our aspirations and our values. How peaceful is the mind? What's the level, what's the quality of our minds? And so eudaimonia then starts with ethics, the way we relate to each other as human beings, animals, the natural environment. It starts there, but it's a type of well-being that also entails a clear conscience, a sense that for the years that I was on this planet, I did more good than harm. My presence here was a gift and not a toxin. You know? And then we can go, so there's the whole dimension of eudaimonia that's related to social and environmental flourishing. But then we can go deeper. And that is, what about when we're sitting quietly in our rooms by ourselves? You know,
if people do that still.
Yeah, people can hardly bear that anymore. But to cultivate an inner calm, a quiet, a balance of mind, a serenity, a sense of benevolence in the mind, such that you're very content to be quiet, sitting alone.
It can be very pleasurable, but I think it'd be very scary too for people.
Well, you get through the scary part, because that's the first thing you see, and then if you move through that, you see, wow, I see a lot of weeds in my garden.
Yeah.
Maybe there's some weeding to be done, some cultivating to be done.
Right.
And to give you one Sanskrit term, the Buddhist term for meditation in Sanskrit is bhavana, and that's, we translate it as meditation, but what it literally means is to cultivate. You're cultivating your mind. Cultivating mental balance, cultivating patience, benevolence, virtues of all kinds, and recognizing the tendencies in the mind that throw us out of balance and give rise to really harmful behavior. We call those mental afflictions, and recognizing them when they come up, and not simply being not judgmental, but recognizing this is, if I'm being very arrogant and condescending to another person, one should recognize I'm being arrogant and condescending to another person, and not just be non-judgmental.
Oh my gosh, I have people that come see me for that, but it can cause like people to have suicidal thoughts, you know, but it can be that extreme.
Sure.
So yeah, the self-love is really important. You know, the
It's
tenderness,
It's crucial.
the patience, the just allowing the person to experience whatever they are going through. But also, that's the problem with the Diagnostic Statistic Manual, the DSM, that psychologists and psychiatrists use, is, and if you are listening and you don't know what that is, kind of like the Bible of psychology, where you go through and you diagnose, is that it just pegs into one spot, which is like the person has so many other things.
So I think there are multiple dimensions, and then even a deeper one. In a Christian tradition, St. Augustine, who wrote at length about eudaimonia, he says the highest eudaimonia, the highest level, is knowing God. It's knowing the deepest truth, the greatest reality. In Buddhism, it's knowing reality as it is. The Delphic Oracle says, know thyself. So really fathoming, who does it mean? What does it mean to be me? What does it mean to be a human being? And
also that you might be different from everybody else. You know, actually, I think that's what makes everybody beautiful, is we're not all the same. But, you know, maybe just allowing you to be who you are and practicing that.
You know, there's a theme in ecology, and I would have been an ecologist had I not found the spiritual path that I'm dedicated to now for 50 years. But a theme in ecology is unity within diversity. And that is a biosphere or a region of land is not healthy or balanced if it has only one species, one plant. But again, if you have a whole bunch of competing plans where they're all struggling and kicking each other out, that's not healthy either.
Right.
If you have a society where everybody's exactly the same ethnic group, the same religious views and so forth, frankly, that's a bit creepy.
Yeah. Well, I know it's
and not really healthy.
Diversity, right, is what you're talking about.
On the other hand, if you have a society that doesn't gel, this group it has its own niche, and another one says, we're not like you, and they're all partisans, and they're all going into their own niches. That's not a society. That's just a lot of people living in proximity with each other. And so we are magnificently unique, each of us. And that could be celebrated, the differences between different religious groups and beliefs. Mm-hmm. The differences, I'm glad there are Republicans and Democrats. I don't want it to be a one-party system. That's for totalitarian, despotic governments. I don't want that.
Right.
And so I'm glad we have two parties. I'm glad we have independence. And so on one hand, yes, diversity politically, ideologically, religiously, I think there's something to celebrate. At the same time, and I'm not on any political campaign here at all, mm-hmm. but there needs to be common ground. However different we have in terms of partisan politics, is there something fundamentally deeper that we all agree upon?
Well, I think, that's kind of outdated. It's like my 13-year-old said, I mean, when the Second Amendment was created, people had muskets, and they had a gun that had gunpowder. He's like, they didn't have AK-40s. I mean, even he says that. And, I mean, it's true. That it's a simple idea. I think we kind of need more simple ways of relating. And I know we just have like a couple more minutes. Maybe you'll come back on and we can talk again. But I was just wondering, I have one more question. I was curious, like, when you, in your work with all the people that you encounter, do you think people do talk about mental health, like, as in a way, like I mean, I know you're around probably people who are like-minded, but also you probably deal with a lot of variety of people. Do you think people, in your experience, are moving toward accepting mental health, and that that's an important component of well-being, or is there a resistance, like a pushback, or what do you think about that?
Clearly, people come to meditation retreats that I lead, and lectures and seminars and so forth. Some Buddhist, some very secular. Clearly, it's a very self-selected audience.
Right.
And so already they're going to be more interested in mental health, well-being, the inner life, and so forth and so on. But from what I know, from the time I was a kid in the 1950s, mm-hmm. and back then, you're going to a shrink? What's wrong with you?
Right.
You're going to a shrink? What's wrong with you?
Exactly.
And the stigma was unabashed, right?
Yes. Yep.
And so globally, have we moved away from that black and white notion? I think we have.
Yeah.
And for one thing, so many people are seeing therapists.
Right. Now,
and often to a lot of benefit.
Yeah, it's become much more socially
And
acceptable.
maybe they come for a week, and then they don't, and then they say, I think I'm good, and then they come back 6 months later. Mm-hmm. And so I think now it's very clearly it's a smooth spectrum. People will just check in once in a while with their therapist.
Right. It doesn't.
And it could be with their rabbi and their therapist, with their imam and their therapist, and so forth.
The support. And
then also just having, the phrase that you know very well, peer counseling, having good and loving, caring friends.
Mm-hmm.
There's really no substitute for that.
Yeah.
And family, if at all possible, a loving family.
Yeah. Well, I think the more support, because when we get isolated, we feel alone, and then we don't
Indeed.
feel connected. We all need to feel interconnected.
All true.
Well, I want to thank you for coming on the show. I was wondering, do you have any final words of wisdom for our listeners?
I feel that the crises we're facing as a human species in the ecosphere, where we are wiping out wildlife and decimating the natural habitat, my strong sense is that the scientific community and researchers in technology have provided us with all the information we need. We caused it. Here's how we're causing it. Here's how we're perpetuating, and here's how we can solve it. I think they've done their homework. They've done everything they need to that they need to do. In which case, we'd be just sending them thank you letters every single day. Thank you for diagnosing the problem and telling us how to solve it. But as Greta Thunberg said to our Congress today, you're not doing enough. This bold 16-year-old young lady from Sweden. And so we know what needs to be done. The wisdom is there, and we find it in our philosophical traditions, in religion, and in science. But we need to come together, and we need to draw on the wisdom that is already there, mm-hmm. and integrate. So the barriers need to drop. Science versus spirituality, this religion versus that religion, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. religious people versus atheists. That's fine. It's diversity. I have no problem with that. but we need to be seeking common ground and coming up with common solutions, and that will take some short-term sacrifice.
I know, it's interesting you say the word integration, because I like to use the word integrity. I mean, there's integrity, and also I think we can feel as people integrated, or we can feel completely fragmented. So I think as we move ourselves more toward integration, right, then we can, as a society, as a whole,
couldn't agree more.
Global world. Well, thank you so much, Alan, for coming on, and just, I want to thank you for sharing all your wisdom, and maybe you can come on and talk more about happiness another time, too, because I know people really are interested in that. We all want happiness. And I think, some ways that we can work together is to help create a supportive environment that can empower and care for the individual. Some ways we can work together are volunteering, checking in with ourselves, learning about other cultures, getting accurate information from accurate, reliable sources. And I think this can lead to an understanding, including, and caring. And I'm always trying to imagine a world where we can share our thoughts and feelings more freely, and we can move toward health for all human beings. And I know there's a lot of work to be done, but if we each do our part toward ending negative perceptions about mental health and raise awareness, we can live in a more safe, loving, and accepting world. And again, I want to thank my special guest, Alan, for coming in today and sharing his wisdom. So thank you. If you have any other questions, you can write to me on my Facebook page, The Dr. Deborah Show. Also, if you or someone you know needs help, there's a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week hotline through Santa Barbara County Access, and it's 1-888-868-1649. And we'll look forward to talking to you next week. We're live at KCSB FM Santa Barbara 91.9.
KCSB FM Santa Barbara 91.9. KCSB News presents Inside Isla Vista, a weekly show covering an array of issues of interest to the Isla Vista community. The goal of the show is to educate